September 2024. Two hikers stand frozen on a windswept ridge, staring at something that shouldn't exist. Lars Eriksson and Maria Holst had come to this remote island off the Norwegian coast for solitude, a weekend escape into untouched wilderness where jagged cliffs meet the North Atlantic and human footprints are swallowed by time. But what they're looking at now changes everything. Jutting from beneath decades of moss and wild grass, geometric patterns cut into stone with mechanical precision, not natural formations, not Viking ruins. Something else entirely. Lars kneels, brushing away thick vegetation with trembling hands. Concrete. Weathered and pitted by 80 years of brutal coastal storms, but unmistakably concrete. The edges are too straight, too deliberate. Maria moves along the ridge, her boots crunching on loose scree, and finds more. Rectangular depressions in the earth. Metal fragments rusted into abstract sculptures, and there, half buried beneath a collapsed stone wall, a hatch, circular, heavy, the kind you'd find on a ship or a bunker. They exchange glances, hearts pounding with that particular cocktail of excitement and dread that comes from stumbling into history. This island appears on no tourist maps. Local fishermen avoid it, too rocky, too exposed. Nothing but gulls and memories. Yet here, hidden beneath nature's patient reclamation, lies evidence of human construction on a massive scale. Lars pulls out his phone, snapping photos as gray clouds roll in from the sea. The structures follow a pattern, a layout that suggests planning and purpose. This wasn't a way station or emergency shelter. This was built to last, built to hide, built by someone who never intended to be found. Maria discovers markings on one of the concrete slabs, faded, barely visible but distinct, Germanic lettering. Her pulse quickens. She's an amateur historian, spent years studying World War II sites across Scandinavia, but she's never seen anything like this. They came here looking for adventure, for a story to tell friends over drinks. Instead, they've found a ghost, a secret buried so deep that even the island itself seemed to forget. As the first drops of rain begin to fall, they make a decision. This discovery demands answers. 79 years ago, someone vanished into this wilderness and built a fortress that time tried desperately to erase. Tomorrow, they'll contact the authorities. Tonight, they'll camp here, guarding a mystery that's waited nearly 8 decades to be told. To understand what those hikers found, you have to go back to the spring of 1945, when the Third Reich was collapsing like a house built on sand and desperation. Back to a man named Heinrich Vogel, Rear Admiral Heinrich Vogel, one of the Kriegsmarine's most brilliant and ruthless strategists. Vogel wasn't a household name, not like Dunitz or Raeder, but among naval intelligence circles, his reputation was formidable. Born in Kiel in 1901, he'd risen through the ranks with calculated precision, earning decorations for his tactical innovations in U-boat warfare. Cold, analytical. A man who saw the Atlantic not as an ocean but as a chessboard where he moved invisible pieces against Allied convoys. By 1943, he'd coordinated wolf-pack operations that sent hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom. But Vogel was more than a warrior. He was a believer. A true adherent to the ideology that drove the war machine, convinced that Germany's destiny transcended temporary setbacks. While others began quietly planning escapes or surrenders, Vogel remained fanatically loyal. He had to be. He'd invested everything, his career, his conscience, his soul, into the cause. Which makes what happened next even stranger. May 1945. Flensburg, the makeshift capital of a dying regime. Hitler dead, Berlin captured, German forces surrendering across Europe. Admiral Donitz, now nominal head of state, preparing for the inevitable. And there, amid the chaos, sits Vogel in a cramped office, overlooking the harbor, studying maps by candlelight. Witnesses later reported seeing him that final week, agitated but purposeful, meeting with select officers behind closed doors. Coded messages passed between headquarters and unknown recipients. Supply requisitions that made no sense for a defeated Navy. Then, on May 7th, one day before the official surrender, Heinrich Vogel simply vanished. No goodbye to his wife in Hamburg, no formal resignation, no body recovered from the rubble. He walked out of that Flensburg office and disappeared so completely that the official records simply listed him as missing, presumed dead in the final collapse. His family waited for word that never came. His name appeared on memorial lists alongside thousands of others consumed by war's final chaos. The Allies, drowning in the aftermath, had bigger fish to catch, tracking down concentration camp commanders, hunting war criminals, managing millions of displaced persons. One missing admiral? A footnote, a statistic. The world moved on. But Heinrich Vogel hadn't died in those final days. He'd done something far stranger. Something that would remain hidden for 79 years, buried on a remote island where the wind howls secrets and the sea keeps watch over the ruins of obsession. April 1945. The world is ending, at least for the Third Reich. Soviet artillery pounds Berlin into dust. American and British forces sweep across Germany from the west. The 1,000-year Reich has maybe 1,000 hours left. In Flensburg, far from the burning capital, Admiral Heinrich Vogel sits in a locked room with 3 other officers whose names history will never record. On the table between them lies a single folder marked with a fog-gray seal. Operation Naval. Fog. The word carries weight in naval circles: obscurity, concealment, the art of disappearing. This isn't about fighting anymore. This is about survival, about waiting, about believing so deeply in eventual victory that you're willing to vanish into the unknown for years, decades even, until the time comes to resurface. The plan had been conceived months earlier by a paranoid inner circle convinced that military defeat didn't mean ideological death. Select officers would be given coordinates, resources, and orders to establish hidden outposts in remote locations across the Nordic region. Places so isolated that no Allied patrol would stumble upon them. Places where small groups could sustain themselves indefinitely, maintaining radio silence, waiting for coded signals that would announce the resurgence. Madness? Perhaps. But in those final weeks, with the world collapsing, madness wore the uniform of conviction. Vogel receives his assignment, a barren island northwest of Norway, uninhabited, rarely visited even by fishermen. He's allocated a U-boat for transport, a crew of volunteers, fanatics, willing to disappear, and enough supplies to last 2 years if rationed carefully. Construction materials, weapons, radio equipment, everything needed to build not just a shelter, but a fortress. The timeline is impossibly tight. By early May, the submarine must be loaded and departed before Allied forces lock down every port. Vogel works around the clock, his movements deliberate, his face betraying nothing. He requisitions materials under false pretenses. He selects his crew carefully, young men, true believers, those with nothing left to lose. He studies meteorological charts, plotting courses through waters soon to be patrolled by victorious Allied navies. On May 6th, under cover of darkness, the U-boat slips from its moorings. 23 men aboard, plus Vogel. They carry with them tools, weapons, food stores, medical supplies, and something else. A conviction that their sacrifice will be remembered as heroic patience rather than desperate delusion. The next day, Vogel's adjutant discovers his office empty, papers burned, safe cleaned out. A single note remains, deliberately vague. Transferred to special assignment. Destroy all records. The adjutant, himself preparing to flee, does exactly that. Within 48 hours, Germany surrenders. The war is over. But for Heinrich Vogel and his crew, navigating through dark waters toward a remote island most maps don't even name, A different kind of war is just beginning. One fought not with torpedoes and tactics, but with isolation and ideology. One that will consume them all. The problem with disappearing during the apocalypse is that no one notices. When an entire civilization collapses, individual absences become statistical noise. Heinrich Vogel's Vanishing Act should have raised questions, triggered investigations, left a trail of confused subordinates demanding answers. Instead, it barely registered as a ripple in an ocean of chaos. The official Kriegsmarine records, such as they were in those final days, listed Rear Admiral Heinrich Vogel as present at Flensburg headquarters through May 6, 1945. After that, nothing. No transfer orders, no court-martial for desertion, no body recovered, just a blank space where a man used to be. When Allied forces took control of German naval installations, they found filing cabinets full of incomplete records, burned documents, and deliberate obfuscations. Officers had frantically destroyed evidence of war crimes, concealed U-boat movements, eliminated any paper trail that might lead to prosecution. In that inferno of self-preservation, Vogel's absence was barely noteworthy. By August 1945, as the Allies compiled lists of missing German military personnel, Vogel's name appeared alongside 11,000 others, a statistic in a ledger, nothing more. Presumed dead. The assumption was logical enough. Plenty of officers had committed suicide rather than face capture. Others died in the final bombings, their bodies never identified. Some simply walked away into the rubble and vanished into civilian life under false names. Without evidence of survival, Vogel was filed away as another casualty of Germany's collapse. His wife, Greta, living in bombed-out Hamburg with their 2 daughters, received no official notification. She wrote letters to former colleagues, to military bureaus, to anyone who might know something. The responses, when they came at all, were identical. No information available, presumed lost in the final chaos, our condolences. By 1947, she stopped asking. By 1950, she'd remarried a schoolteacher named Weber, who adopted her daughters and never asked about their real father. The name Vogel faded from the family tree. Heinrich's younger brother, who'd survived the Eastern Front, never spoke of him. Too many Germans were trying to forget those years, to bury the past along with the bodies. A missing admiral who'd coordinated U-boat attacks? Better left unremembered. Better left in whatever grave the war had dug for him. Historians, in the decades that followed, occasionally encountered Vogel's name in declassified documents. A footnote here. A mention in convoy attack reports there. But nothing suggesting mystery or intrigue. Just another officer who'd served, vanished, and passed into the archive of forgotten men. No one connected the dots. No one asked why a rear admiral would disappear so completely in the war's final hours. No one imagined that he hadn't died at all, that he was very much alive, hundreds of miles away, on a windswept island, building a fortress against reality itself. History had moved on. But the truth was waiting, buried beneath moss and concrete, for 2 hikers with camera phones and an instinct that something wasn't right. The island has no official name on most maps. Locals in the nearest Norwegian fishing village, 70 nautical miles southeast, call it Gråstein Greystone, if they call it anything at all. It's a jagged scar of volcanic rock thrust up from the North Atlantic, roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide at its broadest point. Cliffs rise sharply from the churning sea, their faces scarred by centuries of storms that hit with the force of artillery barrages. No trees, no harbor, no reason for anyone to go there. The island sits in that desolate stretch between Norway and Iceland, where shipping lanes veer away and even modern vessels give wide berth during winter months. The weather is viciously unpredictable, fog rolling in so thick you can't see your own hands, then suddenly clearing to reveal horizons that stretch forever. Wind speeds regularly exceed 50 miles per hour. The temperature, even in summer, rarely climbs above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain falls sideways. The rock itself offers little hospitality. Basalt and granite, weathered into cruel formations that shred boots and snap ankles. Tide pools filled with freezing water. Colonies of screaming gulls defending nesting sites with kamikaze determination. The only vegetation consists of hardy moss, patches of wild grass, and stubborn lichens that cling to stone like they're holding on for dear life. Historical records show no permanent settlement ever existed here. Viking expeditions bypassed it. Why bother with a rock that offers nothing? Whalers in the 18th and 19th centuries used it occasionally as a landmark for navigation, but never dropped anchor. By the 20th century, with modern navigation equipment, even that marginal utility disappeared. The island became truly forgotten, a blank spot on charts that mariners simply ignored. Which made it perfect. Perfect for someone who wanted to disappear so completely that even the search wouldn't begin. Perfect for a man willing to trade civilization for isolation if it meant clinging to a cause. Perfect for building something that wasn't meant to be found for decades, if ever. The northern end of the island rises to a plateau roughly 300 feet above sea level. From the sea, it's just another rocky outcrop. But from above, from the perspective of someone actually standing there, the plateau offers something rare. Relatively flat ground, sheltered from the worst winds by a natural ridge formation. Space enough to build, protection enough to survive, isolation enough to stay hidden. In 1945, when Heinrich Vogel first saw this place through a U-boat periscope, he must have recognized it immediately. Not as a home, but as a tomb. A place where men could be buried alive, sustained by ideology and stubbornness, waiting for a signal that would never come. The island didn't care about their plans. It had witnessed volcanic eruptions, ice ages, millennia of waves grinding against its shores. 23 men building bunkers? Just another brief moment in geological time. The island would outlast them. It would swallow their fortress, reclaim their construction, bury their bones beneath moss and stone. And it nearly succeeded. For 79 years, Grostein kept its secret, revealed to no one, disturbed by nothing except weather and wildlife. Until two hikers made a decision to explore a place that existed on their GPS, but nowhere in their guidebooks. Lars Eriksson isn't just a hiker. He's an industrial archaeologist, someone who spends weekends exploring abandoned factories and forgotten infrastructure across Scandinavia, documenting the physical remnants of history before they crumble entirely. Maria Holst teaches geology at the University of Bergen and has a side passion for World War II historical sites. When they planned this trip to Grostein, they expected nothing more than dramatic coastline photos and maybe some interesting rock formations. What they found instead triggers every alarm bell in their professional minds. The concrete structures are wrong for this location, wrong era for Viking ruins, wrong construction method for anything natural. Lars runs his fingers over the weathered surface, noting the aggregate composition, the way rebar protrudes at specific angles. This is mid-20th century military-grade construction. German, if he had to guess. The geometry is too precise, too purposeful. Maria maps the site with her phone's GPS, marking each structure they discover. The layout emerges. Rectangular depressions arranged in a defensive pattern, all oriented toward the sea approaches. Overlapping fields of fire, if these had been gun emplacements. A central cluster that might have been living quarters. And those metal fragments Lars keeps finding hinges, brackets, frame pieces, all showing consistent corrosion patterns, suggesting they've been exposed for roughly 80 years. Then, Maria finds the hatch. It's partially buried beneath a collapsed stone wall that looks deliberately camouflaged, covered with decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. But the metal underneath, though rusted, is unmistakable, a circular submarine-style hatch, maybe 3 feet in diameter, sealed shut by corrosion and time. They try to open it, straining against the mechanism, but it won't budge. What's underneath? A bunker? A storage facility? Shelter for how many people? Lars photographs everything from multiple angles, making detailed notes. Maria collects small samples of the concrete, careful not to disturb the site more than necessary. They both understand what they're looking at, even if they don't want to say it aloud yet. This is a World War II installation. Hidden, forgotten, completely absent from any historical record they've ever encountered. That night, camped in their tent with wind howling across the plateau, they make calls on their satellite phone. First to the Norwegian Coastal Administration, who seemed confused about why anyone would be on Gråstein at all. Then to the Directorate for Cultural Heritage in Oslo. That call gets transferred 3 times before reaching someone who actually understands the significance. Dr. Stein Haugen, a specialist in World War II archaeology, listens to their description with growing intensity. "Don't touch anything else," he says, static crackling across the connection. "We're assembling a team. Can you stay on site for 72 hours? They can. They will. Because they both realize they've stumbled into something extraordinary, a ghost story written in concrete and steel, a mystery that history forgot to solve. Somewhere beneath that hatch, beneath the moss and the rubble, lies the answer to a question no one knew to ask. What happened to the men who built this place? And why did they come here to vanish? Within a week, Gråstein transforms from a forgotten rock into a historical crime scene. 2 helicopters ferry equipment and personnel from the Norwegian mainland, landing on the plateau in conditions that make the pilots curse under their breath. Dr. Stein Haugen arrives with a team of 12 archaeologists, structural engineers, World War II historians, and a forensic specialist whose presence suggests they're expecting to find more than just empty rooms. The Norwegian government has fast-tracked permits, recognizing that whatever lies buried here could rewrite chapters of war history. Ground-penetrating radar equipment gets assembled first, carried piece by piece up from the makeshift landing zone. The technicians work in shifts, scanning the plateau in a grid pattern while wind threatens to blow their equipment off the cliff face. What the radar reveals stops everyone cold. The underground construction extends far beyond the visible surface structures. A main corridor runs nearly 100 feet into the bedrock, branching into multiple chambers. Storage areas, living spaces. A complex large enough to house 24 people with room to spare. One technician points to his screen, voice tight with disbelief. "This chamber here? It's reinforced with steel framing. And look at this, some kind of ventilation shaft running up through the rock to a concealed surface outlet." Dr. Haugen studies the data, his mind racing through possibilities. This wasn't hastily constructed. This took planning, expertise, resources. Someone had invested serious effort into making this place habitable for the long term. But who and when? The concrete samples Maria collected come back from preliminary analysis. Mid-1940 seconds composition, consistent with German military construction from the war's final years. That timeline fits with other fragmentary evidence, the hatch design, the structural methodology, the strategic location. But there's no record of any German installation this far north, this isolated. No Allied intelligence reports, no post-war documentation, nothing. The Norwegian Ministry of Defense gets involved, sending a liaison officer who asks pointed questions about what else they might find. Weapons, documents, bodies? No one has answers yet, but the questions hang heavy over the excavation site. A full-scale dig is authorized with unusual speed. Funding appears from multiple sources, academic institutions hungry for discovery, government agencies concerned with national security history, even a German foundation dedicated to documenting World War II sites. Within 10 days of Lars and Maria's discovery, Gråstein hosts the largest archaeological operation in Norwegian waters since the Oseberg Viking ship excavation. Heavy equipment can't be brought to the island, too remote, too fragile, too dangerous. Everything must be done by hand. Teams of workers carefully remove soil and rubble, documenting every layer, photographing every artifact. The weather fights them constantly. Rain delays, work for days. Fog so thick they implement buddy systems to prevent anyone from walking off a cliff. Storms that force complete evacuation to the mainland, leaving expensive equipment lashed down and covered in tarps, praying it survives until they can return. But slowly, painstakingly, the site yields its secrets. The hatch gets unsealed using careful application of penetrating oil and mechanical leverage. When it finally opens with a shriek of protesting metal, the team crowds around, shining flashlights into the darkness below. A ladder descends into blackness. The air that escapes smells of damp stone, rust, and something else, something organic and long dead. Dr. Haugen volunteers to go first, strapping on a headlamp and respirator. His voice echoes up from below, tight with controlled excitement. There's a corridor, concrete walls, intact ceiling. I'm going deeper. The radio crackles. 15 seconds of silence. Then, my God, it's a complete installation. We're going to need more lights. Much more lights. The fortress reveals itself like a photograph developing in chemicals, details emerging from darkness into harsh LED illumination. What Dr. Haugen finds beneath that hatch exceeds every hypothesis, every educated guess. This isn't a simple bunker or emergency shelter. This is a fully realized underground complex, engineered for long-term survival in complete isolation. The main corridor extends 80 feet into the bedrock, 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, walls lined with reinforced concrete that shows minimal cracking despite 8 decades of exposure. Someone knew what they were doing. The engineering is sophisticated, professional, military grade. Off the main corridor, 6 chambers branch out like ribs from a spine. The first room is clearly a command center, metal desk, still standing, chairs corroded but recognizable, shelving units along the walls. Maps once hung here. You can see the mounting brackets, though the maps themselves have long since deteriorated. A radio set sits in the corner, its vacuum tubes shattered, wiring corroded to green powder, but the basic structure still intact. German manufacture, confirmed by markings visible beneath the rust. The second and third chambers served as living quarters. Metal bunk frames, 3 high, line the walls. 12 beds total, enough for the crew to sleep in shifts. Personal items scatter the floor, a shaving kit, its razor blade rusted to nothing, a small Bible with pages fused together by moisture, a harmonica so corroded it crumbles when touched, photographs, impossible to restore, showing only vague shadows of faces long forgotten, evidence of men trying to maintain humanity in inhuman conditions. The fourth chamber is storage. Here, the preservation improves because many items were sealed in metal containers. Tinned food, the labels illegible, but the contents presumably still inside, though no one's brave enough to open them yet. Medical supplies in rotted boxes, bandages, medications, surgical instruments that gleam dully under the lights. Ammunition cases, stacked neatly, containing rounds for weapons not yet found. And uniforms, Kriegsmarine uniforms, folded precisely, name tags still legible on some. The archaeologists photograph each item's position before touching anything. But it's the fifth chamber that changes everything, the ventilation room. Here, an elaborate system of pipes and fans shows incredible ingenuity. They'd tapped into natural fissures in the rock, creating airflow that would have kept the complex breathable indefinitely. A diesel generator sits in the corner, smaller than expected, but enough to run essential systems for hours each day. Fuel storage tanks, nearly empty now, their contents evaporated over decades. This system could have sustained life here for years if maintained properly. The sixth chamber is locked. A steel door, unlike anything else in the complex. Dr. Haugen and his team work on it for 2 days, carefully cutting through the corroded lock mechanism rather than destroying the door itself. When it finally swings open, They find themselves in Admiral Vogel's private quarters, though they don't know his name yet. A single bunk, a desk with drawers, a locker containing personal effects. And on the desk, wrapped in oilcloth that kept moisture at bay, a leather-bound journal. Dr. Haugen lifts it with trembling hands, his breath fogging inside the respirator. The cover bears an embossed eagle and swastika. Inside, pages filled with neat Germanic script, dated entries running from April 1945 forward. "We've found it," he whispers into his radio. "We've found their story." Above ground, the team has discovered more. The surface structures weren't just random placement, they formed a defensive perimeter. Positions for machine guns, now absent. Observation posts with sightlines covering the sea approaches. A camouflaged antenna installation that would have allowed radio communication, though the equipment itself is long gone, probably swept away by storms or deliberately dismantled. Everything points to the same conclusion. This wasn't a hiding place. This was a garrison, a fortress built by men who expected to stay indefinitely, who believed they were serving some greater purpose. Men who vanished into this rock and never left. The question now isn't what they built, it's why, and what happened to them all. The preservation inside the sealed chamber borders on miraculous. While the outer rooms suffered decades of moisture seepage and temperature fluctuations, Admiral Vogel's private quarters remained relatively sealed, protected by that heavy steel door and gaskets that held barely against time's patient assault. Dr. Haugen's team works under portable cleanroom conditions, wearing gloves and masks, treating each item like the historical treasure it is. The uniform hangs in the locker, still recognizable despite deterioration. A Kriegsmarine Rear Admiral's dress coat, the insignia tarnished but intact. Beneath it, everyday working clothes, wool trousers, cotton shirts, all bearing the same name tag stitched inside. H. Vogel. A cap rests on the upper shelf, its eagle and swastika emblem, a jarring reminder of whose fortress this was. Personal effects fill the desk drawers with heartbreaking mundanity. A fountain pen, dried ink still visible in the reservoir. A pocket watch, stopped at 3:17, the date lost to history. Photographs these survived better than others, protected in a metal case. A woman, 2 young girls, his family presumably. Their faces smile from a world that no longer existed when these photos were sealed away. Navigation charts, spread across the desk, show routes from Flensburg to various Nordic locations, with one route marked in red ink, leading to coordinates that match Großstein exactly. Notations in the margins, tide tables, weather patterns, fuel calculations. This wasn't improvised. This was meticulously planned. But the journal is everything. Bound in leather, roughly 8 inches by 10, filled with nearly 200 pages of careful handwriting. Dr. Haugen doesn't read German fluently, so he photographs every page before a specialist begins translation. The team gathers in the command center, now lit by work lights powered by a portable generator, as the translator Dr. Kristen Weber from the University of Hamburg reads the first entry aloud. The 28th of April, 1945. Received orders for Operation Nebel. The Führer is dead, but the cause lives on. We are to be the seed that waits in darkness for spring. Silence follows those words. Everyone understands they're holding something unprecedented, a first-hand account from men who disappeared into deliberate obscurity. True believers so committed they chose exile over surrender. The entries continue chronologically, written in Vogel's precise hand. Early pages describe the preparation, the submarine journey, the landing on Großstein in rough seas that nearly capsized their inflatable boats. The construction phase, back-breaking work digging into rock, pouring concrete mixed with seawater because fresh water was too precious to spare, installing the ventilation system with engineering expertise that saved their lives. Names appear throughout. Kapitänleutnant Ernst Zimmermann, the second in command. Dr. Klaus Brenner, the medical officer. Wilhelm Koch, the engineer who designed the ventilation system. 23 names total, each man introduced with rank and specialty. Young men mostly, the eldest, besides Vogel, only 32. Men who volunteered for this mission believing they were heroes rather than ghosts. The tone in these early entries is confident, almost optimistic. Vogel writes about maintaining discipline, establishing work schedules, rationing supplies. He references radio equipment they'd installed, listening frequencies they'd monitor for coded signals from other Operation Nebel sites. He believed with absolute certainty that they'd wait here for months, maybe a year, before receiving new orders. He believed the Reich would rise again. Doctor, Weber pauses, looking up from the journal with something like pity in her eyes. There are 2 years of entries here. Should I continue? Doctor, Haugen nods slowly. Every word. We need to know what happened to them. What happened is written in ink that never faded, preserved in darkness, waiting 79 years for someone to read the story of men who built a fortress against reality itself. The full scope of Operation Nebel emerges from Vogel's journal like a conspiracy theory, except it's real, documented in the Admiral's own hand. Doctor, Weber translates through the night, her voice growing hoarse as the entries paint a picture of fanaticism disguised as strategic planning. Operation Nebel, Operation Fog, was conceived in late 1944 by a cabal of high-ranking Nazi officials who refused to accept that defeat was inevitable. The plan was simple in concept, insane in execution. Establish a network of hidden outposts across remote locations in the Nordic region, Antarctica, and South America. Stock them with true believers, supplies, and communication equipment. Wait. When the Reich fell because even they acknowledged it might fall temporarily, these cells would remain dormant, maintaining readiness, preserving ideological purity until the time came to re-emerge. Vogel's entry from the 3rd of May 1945 lays it out with chilling clarity. We are not abandoning the fight. We are continuing it through strategic withdrawal. History will remember us not as deserters, but as the guardians who kept the flame alive during the dark years. Our children's children will celebrate our sacrifice. The journal reveals that at least 7 other sites were planned, though Vogel only knew the location of his own. Compartmentalization, he wrote, was essential for security. If one site was discovered, the others would remain hidden. Each site had a designated commanding officer, a crew of volunteers, and enough resources to survive independently for 2 to 3 years. They'd monitor specific radio frequencies, waiting for coded messages that would provide new instructions. The messages never came. Vogel describes the submarine journey in detail: 6 days of running submerged during daylight, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and navigate by stars. They traveled in complete radio silence, aware that Allied naval forces controlled these waters. The U-boat commander, whose name Vogel doesn't record, dropped them off Grostein's coast on the 11th of May, 1945, 3 days after Germany's surrender. The submarine departed immediately, never to return. 23 men stood on that rocky shore watching their last connection to civilization disappear beneath dark waves. They carried with them weapons and ammunition for defense, construction materials prefabricated for rapid assembly, 2 years' worth of preserved food, medical supplies, radio equipment, a diesel generator with fuel, and most importantly, absolute conviction that they were right. The early weeks, according to the journal, were consumed with construction. They worked 18-hour days, hauling materials up from the beach, digging into bedrock, pouring concrete, installing systems. Vogel writes with pride about their efficiency. The complex was habitable within a month, fully operational within 3. He instituted strict military discipline, watches rotated every 4 hours, meals served at precise times, mandatory physical training, weapons practice, ideological education sessions where they'd read from approved texts and discuss strategy for the glorious return. Daily radio monitoring began in June 1945. They'd gathered around the receiver, listening through static for coded signals that would tell them what to do next. Nothing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Vogel's entries show growing concern masked by forced optimism. The 15th of August 1945, still no contact from command. This is expected. The Allies control communications. We remain patient. Our purpose is clear, even in silence. By October 1945, the tone shifts subtly. Vogel notes tension among the crew, questions about how long they'd wait, suggestions that maybe they should attempt to make contact rather than passively monitor. He dismissed these concerns with typical authoritarian efficiency. Doubt was weakness. Patience was strength. Their orders were clear, even in the absence of communication. The journal reveals something else troubling. They weren't just waiting, they were preparing for guerrilla operations, planning sabotage missions against Allied shipping, convinced they'd eventually receive orders to strike. Vogel had maps of shipping lanes, notes on vulnerable targets, tactical plans for small unit actions. None were ever executed. They remained on the island, day after day, month after month, waiting for orders from a regime that no longer existed, from commanders who were dead or imprisoned or trying desperately to forget they'd ever worn a uniform. Dr. Haugen listens to the translation with growing horror. They didn't know, he says quietly, or they knew but couldn't accept it. Dr. Weber shakes her head. Vogel knew. Look at this entry from December 1945. Reports from the outside world, though fragmentary, suggest total occupation. The Allies claim victory, but claims are not reality. We maintain our vigil. He was getting information somehow, maybe from fishing boats they saw at distance, maybe intercepting civilian radio broadcasts. He knew the war was over, he just refused to believe it mattered. The journal becomes a window into psychological deterioration disguised as routine. Vogel's entries from late 1945 into 1946 maintain the structure of military log-keeping dates, weather conditions, duty rosters, supply inventories, but between the lines, desperation bleeds through like water staining concrete. Daily life followed rigid patterns because patterns were all they had left. Reveal at 0600 hours. Calisthenics on the plateau regardless of weather. Men doing jumping jacks in sleet and fog because discipline mattered, because routine prevented thinking too much. Breakfast. Reconstituted eggs, tinned meat, black bread baked from dwindling flour stores. Morning watch. 2 men stationed at observation posts, scanning horizons for ships that never came, threats that never materialized. Vogel rotated assignments obsessively, ensuring no one grew too comfortable, too familiar with any single task. Afternoons meant maintenance checking, ventilation systems, repairing storm damage, treating the concrete surfaces against erosion. They painted and repainted equipment that didn't need painting. They cleaned weapons that never fired except during practice. They inventoried supplies they'd already counted 100 times. Anything to fill the hours between radio monitoring sessions. The radio became their religion, the static their prayer. 4 times daily, they'd gather around the receiver, listening to designated frequencies, hoping for coded messages that would validate their sacrifice. Vogel writes about these sessions with painful detail. The anticipation, the crushing disappointment when nothing came, the forced cheerfulness as he'd remind his men that silence was expected, that patience was their greatest weapon. The 22nd of January 1946, Koch suggested we might attempt to send a message rather than simply receive. I explained again that transmission would reveal our position. We are to remain silent until activated. He understands, though I sense frustration among some of the men. The isolation gnawed at them in ways Vogel couldn't discipline away. They had no newspapers, no contact with families, no confirmation that the world they'd left still existed. They'd brought books, military manuals, approved ideological texts, some technical references. These circulated endlessly. Men memorized passages without meaning to, could recite entire chapters from sheer repetition. Dr. Brenner, the medical officer, appears frequently in entries from this period. He treated injuries from the harsh work, broken fingers, wrenched backs, cuts that became infected in the damp environment. But increasingly, he dealt with psychological complaints, insomnia, depression, anxiety, men experiencing what we'd now call panic attacks. Vogel's response was predictable. The 8th of March, 1946. Brenner reports continued morale issues among the younger crew. I reminded him that we are soldiers, not civilians. Mental fortitude is a choice. Increased physical training should resolve these complaints. It didn't. The entries reveal small rebellions, minor fractures in the perfect discipline Vogel demanded. Zimmerman, the second in command, began questioning decisions respectfully at first, then with growing boldness. Why couldn't they establish contact with the mainland? Why not send one man to gather intelligence? Why remain isolated when isolation was destroying them? Vogel rejected every suggestion, growing more rigid as challenges mounted. Food supplies became a constant anxiety. They'd planned for 2 years, rationed carefully, but by spring 1946, the calculations looked grim. Fish supplemented their diet. The waters around Grostein teemed with cod and haddock, but fishing in those violent seas was dangerous work. 2 men nearly drowned in April when their boat capsized. They lost equipment, precious rope, and almost lost lives. The 11th of May, 1946, 1 year since our arrival, I gathered the men for a ceremony, reminding them of our purpose, our sacrifice, our certainty of eventual vindication. Some faces showed belief. Others showed only exhaustion. Zimmerman asked when I expected contact to resume. I told him, when the time is right. He did not seem satisfied with this answer. The world beyond their island moved on, oblivious to their existence. Germany was being divided, rebuilt, denazified. The Nuremberg trials were exposing atrocities. Families were grieving, cities were rising from rubble, survivors were learning to live again. And on Grostein, 23 men performed calisthenics in the rain and listened to static and pretended their sacrifice meant something. Dr. Weber pauses in her translation, looking at the archaeological team with hollow eyes. It gets worse, she says simply, much worse. The journal entries from mid-1946 forward document a descent that's painful to read. Vogel's handwriting, previously precise and controlled, begins to show strained letters pressed harder into paper, occasional scratch-outs, margins filled with calculations that don't quite add up. The facade of military order was cracking, and no amount of discipline could hold it together. The 3rd of July, 1946. Rationed the remaining flour to extend supplies through October. The men complain but comply. Caught Seaman Fisher stealing extra rations from stores, confined him to quarters for 3 days. Made an example. Theft is theft, regardless of hunger. Arguments erupted with increasing frequency. Zimmerman openly challenged Vogel's leadership during what should have been a routine staff meeting. The journal describes the confrontation with barely controlled rage. He suggested no, demanded that we abandon this post, said our orders were void, that the Reich no longer exists, that we're wasting our lives on a dead cause. I relieved him of his duties immediately. He will perform manual labor until he remembers his oath. But Zimmerman wasn't wrong, and others knew it. 2 factions emerged, those still loyal to Vogel and the mission, and those who wanted to leave, to surrender, to rejoin whatever world existed beyond their prison of stone and ideology. The split poisoned everything. Men who'd worked together for over a year stopped speaking. Meals became silent, tense affairs. The 14th of August 1946 entry changes everything. Fisher and Hartman took the boat, gone when Morning Watch discovered their absence. They left a note, cowards' words about wanting to see their families, about the war being over, about us being forgotten. They've stolen supplies, betrayed their oaths, endangered us all. If they reach the mainland and talk, Allied forces could come for us. We must assume compromise and prepare accordingly. The two deserters never made it. Vogel's journal mentions, almost as an afterthought 3 weeks later, that wreckage washed ashore pieces of their boat, shattered by the rocks or storms or simple misfortune. No bodies were ever found. The North Atlantic took them, as it had taken so many before. Their deaths didn't silence the descent. If anything, it made things worse. The 29th of September 1946. Dr. Brenner approached me with concerns about the crew's mental state. He used terms like collective trauma and psychological deterioration. I told him we are soldiers, not patients. He persisted, suggesting we might consider. I will not write what he suggested. His medical judgment is clearly compromised by extended isolation. The supplies situation became critical. Fish helped, but they needed calories that the sea couldn't provide. Vogel ordered reduced rations, calculating that they could extend provisions into early 1947 if everyone cooperated. Not everyone did. The journal reveals a descent into paranoia. The 18th of October, 1946. Someone is stealing from our stores. Small amounts, difficult to detect, but the inventory discrepancies are undeniable. I've instituted locked storage and random inspections. Trust has become a luxury we cannot afford. Vogel's writing grows darker, his references to maintaining order taking on sinister overtones. He doesn't explicitly describe what he means, but implications surface. The 2nd of November, 1946. Koch questioned my leadership openly during assembly, made claims about my mental fitness to command. I had no choice but to act decisively. The men needed to see that insubordination carries consequences. He is confined until he recants. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was brutal. Storms battered the island relentlessly. The generator failed twice, leaving them in darkness for days, while Koch, released from confinement because his engineering skills were indispensable, worked repairs. Food ran so low that Vogel writes about men fighting over scraps, about having to post guards on the remaining supplies, about the hollow-eyed desperation that hunger brings. The 15th of January 1947. We are 21 now. Brenner died 3 days ago. Pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition. We buried him on the eastern ridge, wrapped in his uniform. Some of the men wept. I maintained composure. A commander cannot afford sentiment. 2 men dead from attempting escape, 1 from illness. 20 remained. The journal entries become sporadic, sometimes skipping days or weeks. When Vogel does write, his thoughts fragment, cycling between rigid adherence to protocol and barely suppressed awareness of their situation's hopelessness. March 1947. Still no contact. Still waiting. The world has forgotten us. Or perhaps we forgot the world. Does the distinction matter? We remain. We endure. What are we doing here? Doctor, Haugen listens to the translation in the underground chamber where these events unfolded, surrounded by the physical evidence of deterioration, broken equipment, scattered personal effects, the marks of men slowly losing their grip on purpose and sanity. How many more entries are there, he asks. Doctor. Weber checks the journal, flipping through remaining pages. About 20. Spanning through September 1947. Then nothing. Then we find out how this ends. Haugen says quietly. The ending, they'll discover, is written not just in ink, but in the bones, still waiting to be found. Dr. Weber's voice drops to barely above a whisper as she reaches the final pages of the journal. The handwriting has deteriorated dramatically, no longer the precise military script of the early entries, but shaky, uneven letters that sometimes drift off the page entirely. Whole sentences are crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again. The dates become irregular. Days pass between entries, then weeks, then a final gap before the last words Admiral Heinrich Vogel would ever write. The 21st of May, 1947. Zimmerman is gone. Found him this morning at the base of the cliff. He said he was going to check the observation post. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. 17 of us left. No, 16. I keep forgetting Schwartz. When did Schwartz die? 2 weeks ago? 3? The days blend together like watercolors in rain. The entries from summer 1947 read like dispatches from a collapsing mind. Vogel writes about conversations with men already dead, gives orders to subordinates who no longer exist, references supply counts that make no mathematical sense. Reality and delusion merge until they're indistinguishable. June 1947, date uncertain. Koch says the generator is beyond repair. Or was that last month? The darkness doesn't matter anymore. We've always been in darkness, even when the lights worked. Even before we came here, the whole Reich was darkness pretending to be light. I see that now. Too late, but I see it. Then nothing for weeks. The next entry is dated the 30th of July, 1947, and the handwriting has steadied slightly, as if Vogel pulled himself together one last time. There are 5 of us. 5 men on an island that was supposed to be a fortress and became a graveyard. We don't speak anymore. What is there to say? We made our choices. We swore our oaths. We built this tomb with our own hands and climbed inside willingly. The others understood this earlier than I did. They left some by boat, some by cliff, some simply by lying down and not getting up again. I called them deserters. I called them weak. But they were braver than me. They chose their endings. August brings more deaths. Vogel records them with the detachment of a man documenting weather. The 8th of August, 1947. Weber died in his sleep. Malnutrition, probably. His body weighed nothing when we carried him out. We're too weak to dig anymore. We lay them on the rocks and let the wind take them. The 19th of August, 1947. Kessler and Jung took the last of the rations and left in the night. They didn't take the boat. There is no boat anymore. It broke apart months ago, so they must have tried to swim, or perhaps they simply walked into the sea. I didn't try to stop them. I had no authority left to invoke, no threats that meant anything to men already dead in all but name. The penultimate entry is dated the 9th of September, 1947. I am alone. The last guardian of a cause that died before we even arrived here. I've been reading my early entries, the certainty, the conviction, the absolute belief that we were right. How could I have been so blind? We built this place to preserve something that deserved to die. We sacrificed ourselves for a lie so monstrous that even isolation couldn't protect us from its truth. The others escaped. I remain. Not from duty now, but from something else. Shame, stubbornness, the simple inability to imagine any other existence. I don't know anymore. Then comes the 14th of September, 1947, the final entry. Dr. Weber has to stop twice to compose herself before she can read it aloud. I am the last. The silence is complete. I spend my days in this command center, surrounded by equipment that no longer functions, waiting for orders that will never come, serving a purpose that never existed. I thought we were building a fortress, a place to preserve and protect until the world was ready for us to emerge. But there is no emergence. There is only this, stone and sea, and the endless fog that surrounds this island like a shroud. I think about my wife, Greta. My daughters, they would be 12 and 14 now, if they survived the war. Do they remember me? Do they think of me at all? Or have I become just another name on a memorial, another absence in a nation full of absences? I hope they've forgotten. I hope they've built new lives without the shadow of what I was, what I believed, what I did. I've destroyed the radio, smashed it with a hammer until there was nothing left but fragments. No more listening, no more waiting, no more pretending that static might resolve into meaning. The fog never lifts. Not here, not in my mind. Not from the choices we made or the ideology we served. We thought we were the light, but we were always the fog obscuring truth, distorting reality, leading ourselves and millions of others into darkness. This is my last entry. There's no one left to read it. But perhaps that's fitting. We came here to hide, and hiding is what I'll do until the end. If someone finds this, years from now, know that we were wrong. About everything. The Reich wasn't a glorious cause, it was a disease, and we were symptoms that isolated ourselves too late to matter. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve memory. I ask only that whoever reads this understands. Ideology sustained on certainty alone becomes a prison more complete than any built of stone. The fog never lifts. The page ends there. No signature, no date beyond the 14th of September, 1947. Just those final words hanging in the silence of a tomb that waited 79 years to tell its story. The journal provides testimony, but the island yields proof. Dr. Haugen's team begins the grim work of searching for human remains, guided by Vogel's entries and the logic of desperation. They find the first bodies on the eastern ridge where Vogel mentioned burials, shallow graves marked by stones, skeletons in various states of preservation depending on exposure to elements. Some still have fragments of uniforms clinging to bones. Dog tags identify them: Brenner, Weber, 3 others whose names appeared in the journal. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Signe Anderson, examines each set of remains with clinical precision. Cause of death isn't always clear after 8 decades of exposure, but some evidence persists. Brenner shows signs of pneumonia scarring on rib bones, consistent with Vogel's account. Weber's skeleton reveals severe malnutrition, bones light as bird skeletons, teeth loosened in their sockets from scurvy. One skull shows a depressed fracture. Schwartz, perhaps dead from a fall, Vogel mentioned, but couldn't remember clearly in his deteriorating state. The cliff base yields more remains. Zimmerman's body, or what's left of it, lies among rocks at the bottom of a 200-foot drop. The skeleton is scattered. Scavenger birds did their work over the years, but enough remains for identification through dental records eventually matched with German military archives. Suicide or accident? The journal suggests intention, but the rocks tell no tales beyond the obvious. A man fell, and the fall killed him. More disturbing are the remains found in isolated locations around the island. 2 bodies on the northern shore, positioned as if they'd tried to swim foolish in these waters, fatal within minutes from hypothermia. Kessler and Young, according to the timeline. Their skeletons show no trauma beyond what the sea and rocks inflicted. They simply chose drowning over starvation. DNA analysis begins, though it's complicated. The Norwegian team coordinates with German authorities who access military records from 1945. Families' distant descendants, in most cases, are notified. A granddaughter of one crew member breaks down on a phone call with Dr. Haugen. "We always wondered. My grandmother told stories about her husband who vanished. We thought he'd died in the fighting. I don't know if this is better or worse. 12 sets of remains are recovered from various locations. The math is troubling. Vogel recorded 23 men arriving, 12 bodies found. 2 known to have drowned, attempting to escape in the boat in 1946, their bodies never recovered, taken by the sea. That accounts for 14. 9 remain unaccounted for, besides Vogel himself. The search expands. Teams scour every chamber, every corner of the complex, every accessible part of the island. They find 3 more skeletons in a collapsed section of the underground complex, a tunnel that caved in, possibly during a storm, trapping the men inside. Suffocation or crushing? quick or agonizingly slow, there's no way to know. The bodies had been there since sometime in 1946, based on artifacts found with them. 17 now, 6 still missing, plus Vogel. Then, in the command center, they find him. Admiral Heinrich Vogel's skeleton sits in the chair behind the desk where he'd written his final entry. The journal rests on the desk surface, exactly where he'd left it. His uniform, though deteriorated, is still partially intact enough to identify rank insignia, to confirm this is the commanding officer. The forensic analysis reveals what Vogel's final days were like. Severe malnutrition, his bones show the same lightness as the others, scurvy evident in his teeth and jaw. But what killed him? Dr. Anderson finds the answer in toxicology analysis of bone marrow. Barbiturates, high concentrations, consistent with intentional overdose. He had medical supplies, she explains to the team. Sleeping pills, probably. He wrote his final entry, then he took enough to ensure he wouldn't wake up. Given his physical condition, it wouldn't have taken much. Vogel chose his ending, alone in the command center of a fortress that had become a mausoleum. How long did he survive after that final entry? Hours? Days? The evidence can't say. But at some point in September 1947, the last heartbeat stopped, the last breath left, and Grosstein's secret was complete. 5 men remain unaccounted for. The search continues. But some bodies may never be found, claimed by the sea, buried in rock falls, scattered by storms across an island that fought human presence from the beginning. The forensic evidence confirms what the journal revealed. This wasn't a battle or a massacre. This was slow dissolution, men dying by degrees from isolation, malnutrition, despair, and the crushing weight of serving a cause that offered nothing but death. Dr. Haugen stands in the command center, looking at Vogel's remains being carefully documented and prepared for removal. 79 years this man sat here, undiscovered, his story sealed in leather and ink. They built a fortress, Haugen says quietly, but they were their own prisoners. The bars were ideology, and there was no key. The Norwegian government authorizes full DNA testing and historical documentation. Families will be notified, archives will be updated. The men who vanished in 1945 will finally have their deaths recorded, their remains returned to Germany for burial if descendants request it. But the bigger question, whether anyone will remember them, whether their story deserves preservation or simply documentation as a cautionary tale that remains unanswered. 3 years after Lars Eriksson and Maria Holst discovered the concrete structures on Grosstein, the island has transformed into something between a memorial and a warning. The Norwegian government, in consultation with German historical authorities, designated the site as a protected monument in 2026, not to celebrate what happened here, but to preserve the evidence of what ideology can do when it consumes men completely. The underground complex remains largely as it was found. Stabilization work prevents further collapse, and LED lighting now illuminates the corridors where Vogel's crew lived and died. But the archaeologists resisted any temptation to restore or reconstruct. The rust stays. The deterioration remains visible. The emptiness speaks louder than any renovation could. Visitors come by helicopter during limited summer months. Historians, students, descendants of the crew, people drawn to dark corners of history that resist simple narratives. They walk through the chambers reading placard translations of journal entries, looking at photographs of artifacts now housed in museums, standing in the command center where a man chose death over acknowledging his life's purpose was a lie. The monument's official plaque, installed near the entrance hatch, carries an inscription in Norwegian, German, and English. Here, 23 men imprisoned themselves in service to a cause that had already died. This fortress was built not against external enemies, but against truth itself. Remember them not as heroes or villains, but as a warning. Certainty without questioning becomes the cruelest cage. The remains of 16 crew members were returned to Germany in 2027. Some families claimed them for burial. Others had no living descendants or relatives who wanted any connection to men who'd served the Reich so fanatically they chose exile over surrender. These unclaimed remains were interred in a collective grave at a military cemetery outside Hamburg, marked with a simple stone listing names and the words, "Lost to War and Ideology, 1,945 to 1,947. Admiral Heinrich Vogel's remains sparked debate. His granddaughters Greta had remarried, and her daughters took their stepfather's name, initially refused any connection. "He abandoned us," one told reporters. "He chose his politics over his family. Let him stay where he chose to die." But eventually they agreed to a private burial in Kiel, his birthplace, with no military honors, no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement that he'd existed and made terrible choices. His gravestone carries only his name and dates no rank, no epitaph, nothing that might be misconstrued as honoring what he represented. The journal itself became the subject of intense scholarly attention. Published in full in 2028 with extensive annotations, it provides a rare first-hand account of true believers confronting the collapse of their worldview in real time. Universities use it in courses on extremism, on the psychology of isolation, on how ideology can override survival instinct itself. Dr. Haugen published the definitive archaeological report in 2029, detailing every aspect of the site's construction, habitation, and abandonment. His conclusion is measured but damning. Operation Nebel represents the logical endpoint of totalitarian thinking, the belief that ideology transcends reality, that willpower can substitute for wisdom, that certainty justifies any sacrifice. These men didn't die for their country. They died because they couldn't imagine existing without a cause, even after that cause had revealed itself as monstrous. The broader historical community remains divided on how to contextualize Grosstein. Some argue it deserves attention as evidence of Nazism's lasting psychological damage, how the ideology trapped not just those it victimized, but those who embraced it, creating prisons that persisted long after the physical Reich crumbled. Others worry that any attention, even critical attention, risks romanticizing what was fundamentally pathetic. Men so lost in delusion, they starved themselves on a barren rock rather than face the world they'd helped destroy. What's undeniable is the site's power as a physical space. Visitors describe an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia in the underground complex, even with modern lighting and open hatches. The concrete walls seem to press inward. The silence, broken only by dripping water and wind whistling through ventilation shafts, carries weight. You can feel the isolation these men endured, the slow suffocation of hope, the grinding despair of waiting for meaning that never arrived. Grosstein itself remains largely unchanged. The plateau where the surface structures stand still battles wind and weather. Gulls nest in the ruins. Moss reclaims concrete with patient determination. The island cares nothing for human stories. It predated the fortress by millions of years and will outlast the monument by millions more. Nature is already winning, slowly erasing evidence of those 2 years when men tried to impose order on wilderness that recognized no authority but time and geology. Lars and Maria, the hikers who started everything, occasionally return to the island. They guide specialized tours, sharing the story of their discovery, reflecting on how a weekend hike became something that rewrote a small chapter of history. "We almost didn't come here," Lars tells visitors. "The weather looked bad. We almost chose a different island." Makes you wonder what other secrets are still out there, waiting for someone to stumble across them. The answer, almost certainly, is many. The world is full of forgotten places where forgotten people did forgotten things. Most will stay hidden forever. Some, like Grosstein, yield their secrets when the conditions align, when the right people with the right knowledge happen to be in the right place at the right time. Admiral Heinrich Vogel vanished in May 1945, and history forgot him almost immediately. For 79 years, his story remained sealed in concrete and darkness, known only to the wind and the waves, and the bones scattered across a barren island. Then 2 hikers with cameras and curiosity pulled that story back into light, giving voice to men who'd chosen silence, documenting a tragedy that played out with no witnesses except the participants themselves. The fortress on Grosstein stands now as a monument to a simple truth. Ideology sustained by certainty alone becomes a tomb. The fog Vogel wrote about, the fog that never lifted, wasn't weather. It was the deliberate obscuring of reality in service to belief. The willing blindness that let 23 men build their own prison and die inside it rather than admit they'd been wrong. The wilderness kept their secret for nearly 8 decades. But wilderness has no loyalty to human narratives. Eventually, the wind shifts, the moss pulls back, the concrete reveals itself to curious eyes. Eventually, truth surfaces, even when buried under decades of stone and water and willful forgetting. The fog never lifts, Vogel wrote. But sometimes, given enough time, it thins just enough to see the wreckage it concealed, and we're left to decide what that wreckage means, what lessons it teaches, whether remembering serves any purpose beyond ensuring we don't forget what happens when certainty becomes prison and ideology becomes grave. Grosstein offers no easy answers, only evidence. The rest, the meaning, the lessons, the legacy, that's for the living to determine. This case was brutal, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.